He was dying. Not from a bullet. Not from a rival's knife. Not from any of the thousand dangers that came with being Nico Valetti, head of the most feared crime family on the eastern seaboard. He was dying because no one had ever loved him. And I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking, poor little mafia boss, nobody loves him. I thought the same thing. Until I watched a man who could make entire governments flinch, break down sobbing on a kitchen floor at 2 a.m. because he'd found his dead mother's handwriting on a grocery list. That was the night I stopped surviving my marriage. And started choosing it. My name is Regan Solano. I'm 31 years old. And 18 months ago, I married a man to save my own life. This is the story of how I walked into that marriage expecting a monster, and found something I still don't have a complete word for. It's also the story of what's underneath the violence. The control. The power. The men we call dangerous. Because in my experience, the most dangerous thing about Nico Valetti wasn't his empire. It was how badly he needed someone to see him. And how completely unprepared I was when that someone turned out to be me. How it started. 18 months ago, I was a forensic accountant. Not glamorous. Not dangerous. I sat in a beige office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Chicago and I looked at numbers all day. I was good at it. Exceptionally good. Which is exactly why I was sitting in my car at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, looking at documents I was never supposed to find. My firm had been hired to audit Marchetti Holdings, a massive real estate conglomerate. Legitimate on paper. Spotlessly structured. Except I'm very good at my job. And what I found in those documents, buried under 17 layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, was $340 million in laundered money. Marchetti Holdings wasn't a real estate company. It was a laundry service for the Valetti crime family. I should have closed the files and gone home. Instead, I made a copy. The most catastrophically stupid decision of my life. The threat. They came for me 4 days later. 2 men. My apartment. 7 a.m. I hadn't even had coffee yet. They didn't hurt me. They didn't have to. One of them just put a photograph on my kitchen table. It was my sister. Taken from outside her daughter's school. My niece was in the background, holding a yellow backpack with a butterfly on it. My hands were shaking so badly I knocked over my coffee mug. Mr. Valetti would like to meet with you, the taller man said. Tomorrow. 7 p.m. He'll send a car. Then they left. Just like that. I spent that entire day trying to decide if I should run. Call the FBI. Disappear. But every time I reached for my phone, I thought about that yellow backpack. About my niece's butterfly. And I stayed. The first meeting. The car that arrived the next evening was not what I expected. Not a black SUV with tinted windows. Not something ostentatious. A dark green Jaguar. Understated. Expensive in the way that doesn't need to announce itself. The driver didn't speak. We drove 40 minutes outside the city to a property I'd never seen on any map. And I was taken inside to meet Nico Valetti. I'd looked him up, of course. The photographs online were mostly blurry. Taken from a distance. The FBI's file photo made him look older than he was. In person, he was precise. That's the word. Not handsome, though he was. Not intimidating, though he was that too. Precise. Like every word he used was selected rather than spoken. Like every movement was considered. He was sitting behind a desk when I was brought in. He didn't stand. Didn't offer his hand. Just looked at me with eyes the color of winter water, gray-green and absolutely unreadable. Miss Solano, he said. You found something that wasn't meant to be found. Yes, I said. Because lying seemed pointless. He nodded slowly. I have 2 options for managing that situation, he said. One of them you won't like. And the other? He opened a drawer. Placed a document on the desk between us. Marry me. The real reason. I actually laughed. I know. Terrible instinct. But what else do you do when a mafia boss proposes marriage as an alternative to the other option? He didn't react to the laughter. Just waited. Why? I asked, when I'd collected myself. You could have the documents destroyed. You could pay me off. Why marriage? He was quiet for a moment. Because I need a wife, he said. For strategic reasons. The families have been pressuring me. A man without a wife in my world is a man without stability. Without roots. Easier to challenge. Easier to remove. So this is political. Entirely. And what do I get? Your sister's safety. Your niece's safety. Your own. A significant monthly allowance. Separate rooms. Separate lives, mostly. Attendance at events when required. Duration, 12 months. After that, an amicable public separation. You walk away with $500,000 and a story no one will believe anyway. It was so coldly practical that it almost felt safe. Almost. And the documents I found? Destroyed. Immediately. I looked at this man, this precise, controlled, dangerous man, and I thought, 12 months. I can survive 12 months. Fine, I said. He nodded once. And that was that. He already knew everything. 3 weeks into the marriage, I discovered that Nico Valetti had lied to me. Not about the terms. Not about the safety arrangements or the money. About everything else. I found it by accident, because that's apparently my gift. Finding things I'm not supposed to find. His assistant left a file on the kitchen counter. Mislabeled. I opened it thinking it was the household accounts I'd been asked to review. Inside was a psychological assessment. Of me. 47 pages. Commissioned 8 months before our meeting. Before the audit. Before any of it. Nico Valetti hadn't chosen me because I'd found his documents. He'd arranged for me to find them. My firm had been deliberately steered toward the Marchetti audit by a referral that traced back, through 4 intermediaries, to one of his subsidiary companies. I wasn't a liability he'd found a creative solution for. I was the solution he'd been building toward for almost a year. He'd needed a wife. Someone intelligent enough to function in his world. Someone with enough to lose that she'd stay. Someone with no connections to any family, his or rival. Someone who could be trusted. And so he'd engineered a situation where I would trust him. Because I had no other choice. I sat with that file for 3 hours. Then I went to find him. Before I tell you what happened in that conversation, because it changed everything, make sure you're subscribed. Because what Nico said when I confronted him is not what I expected. And it's going to change how you think about manipulation, control, and the psychology of people who are used to getting what they want. Subscribe now. Don't miss the next part of this story. The confrontation and crack. I found him in his study. Threw the file on his desk. You engineered this, I said. Not a question. He looked at the file. Looked at me. Yes, he said. Just, yes. No apology. No elaborate explanation. You had me investigated for 8 months. Arranged for me to find your documents. Set up an entire. Yes. I stared at him. Why? Of all the women you could have approached directly, why this? Why not just ask? And here is where Nico Valetti did something I had not seen him do before. He paused. Not his usual considered pause. Something different. Something that looked almost like uncertainty. Because women who are asked, he said carefully, make decisions based on what they want. What benefits them. They perform for the role. He looked down at his desk. I needed someone who would be real. Even if real meant angry. Even if real meant. He stopped. What? I pressed. Even if real meant someone who might eventually. Another stop. See past the rest of it, he finished quietly. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, fully. But I didn't leave. The crack in the armor. The grocery list moment happened 6 weeks later. It was 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, I rarely could in that house, early on. I came downstairs for water and heard something from the kitchen that stopped me at the doorway. Nico was sitting on the floor. Not in a chair. On the actual floor, back against the cabinets, knees up, head down. In his hands was a piece of paper, old, slightly yellowed. I should have backed away. Given him privacy. Instead, I said, stupidly, "Are you okay?" He looked up. And for just a moment, before he reconstructed his face into the controlled, precise mask I'd come to expect, I saw it. Raw grief. Undisguised. Unguarded. Like a wound that hadn't healed properly. "What is that?" I asked, nodding at the paper. He looked down at it again. "Grocery list," he said. My mother's handwriting. Found it in a jacket pocket. Forgot I had it. I sat down next to him. Not across from him. Not in a chair. On the floor. Next to him. I don't know why. Some instinct older than strategy. He didn't tell me to leave. We sat there in silence for, I don't know how long. 20 minutes, maybe. 40. And somewhere in that silence, something shifted. Not between us. Something inside him. Like a wall, very slightly, developing a crack. I'd been so focused on surviving this marriage. On counting the weeks. Protecting myself. Staying emotionally distant. I hadn't once considered that Nico Valetti might be doing the same thing. Surviving. Just, from something entirely different. What she discovers. After the kitchen floor, things changed. Not dramatically. Nico wasn't suddenly warm or open or chatty. But the precision of him, the careful measurement of every interaction, began to have a different quality. Like he was being precise because he was afraid. Not because he was calculating. I started noticing things. He never sat with his back to the door. In any room. Always positioned to see every entrance. He checked the window locks himself every night. Every single night, before he went to bed. Not because he didn't have security, he had extraordinary security. But he checked them anyway. He didn't eat anything that someone else prepared until he'd watched them make it. Always. He slept, I learned this because our rooms shared a wall, for approximately 4 hours a night. Maximum. I'd hear him at 3 a.m. 4 a.m. Sometimes 5. As an accountant, I'm trained to look for patterns. And the pattern I was seeing wasn't a powerful man being vigilant. It was a traumatized person who had never in his adult life felt safe. Not once. The truth about his past. I asked him about it directly. One evening over dinner, we'd started eating together, gradually, without either of us deciding to. "What happened to your mother?" I asked. He went very still. "She died," he said. "I know." "How?" "Regan. You had me investigated for 8 months. I think I've earned a real answer to one real question." He set down his fork. "She was killed," he said. "When I was 14. By a man who wanted to send my father a message." "Your father was the previous head of this family." "Yes." "So she was killed because of who he was." "Because of what he built," he corrected. "There's a difference. He didn't just lead this family. He weaponized it. Made enemies on every side. Used everyone around him as leverage." He picked up his fork. Put it back down. I found her, he said quietly. I was the one who. He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't have to. 14 years old. Found his murdered mother. Inherited an empire he never asked for. And spent the next 18 years building walls so high that not a single person had gotten through them. Until a forensic accountant found a grocery list that made everything collapse. I looked at him across that dinner table. And I thought, I had been so busy being afraid of this man. I never noticed he was afraid, too. Things moved differently after that conversation. I stopped counting weeks. I'm not sure exactly when it happened. It wasn't one moment. It was more like the way dawn works. Not a single instant of light but a slow accumulation until you realize it's no longer dark. He started teaching me things. About his world. Not because the contract required it, it didn't. But because I asked questions and he answered them. How to identify when a room has been swept for listening devices. How to read exits. How to hold a conversation with someone who was lying to you without indicating you knew. In return, without intending to, I started giving him something back. I told him the truth. Not about business. About everything else. What it had been like growing up with a father who left when I was 9. What it felt like to be good at something that no one could see, all those numbers, all that precision, invisible in a conference room full of men who took credit for what I found. What it felt like to be alone in a way that doesn't have an obvious cause. Not tragedy. Just the slow erosion of expecting someone to choose you and being surprised every time when they don't. He listened to all of it. Not sympathetically. Not with the practiced empathy of someone performing kindness. He listened like someone starving being handed something real to eat. And I understood then what the 47-page psychological assessment had actually been looking for. Not a useful wife. A real person. He'd spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Who performed loyalty and affection as currency. He'd engineered a situation where I had to be real. Because I had nothing to perform for. I hadn't chosen him. I couldn't pretend I had. And that, somehow, was the only thing he trusted. This is the moment that changed everything. And what happens next, I genuinely didn't see coming, even while I was living it. If this story is resonating with you, hit subscribe right now. And comment below, have you ever been truly seen by someone you weren't expecting? Tell me. I want to know. Now, let me tell you what Nico did that no one in his world had ever done before. Month 8. We'd stopped talking about the 12-month contract. Not because we'd decided anything. Just because it had become an irrelevant feeling. Like a document from someone else's life. I was working in his study one morning. He'd given me access because I'd quietly restructured 3 of his legitimate business accounts and saved him almost $4 million in losses, which he'd found both amusing and useful. His head of security, a man named Drago who communicated mostly in monosyllables and meaningful silences, appeared in the doorway. Problem, he said. That was how I learned that the Ferrante family, rivals to the Valetti Empire for 30 years, had obtained something. Not documents. Not money. Information. About me. Voice steadies, she's telling this from the other side, but the memory is sharp. Someone in Nico's organization had talked. Sold information about the marriage. About what I knew. About the fact that I was, allegedly, a weakness. A way in. The Ferrante family had sent a message. They wanted me delivered to them. In exchange, they'd stand down from a challenge they'd been building for 2 years. If Nico refused, they'd already taken my sister. I sat in that study and waited for the man I'd married to calculate the exchange rate of my family versus his empire. Because that's what I expected. A cost-benefit analysis. The kind I would have run myself 18 months ago. Sister and niece on one side. 2 years of strategic threat on the other hand. And me, the variable. The thing that could balance the equation. I sat very still. And I waited. Nico looked at Drago. "Get her sister out," he said. "Now. Before they move her." Drago looked uncertain, which from him was essentially panic. "And the Ferrante response?" "I'll handle it." "Nico." I said I'll handle it. His voice was quiet. Final. Drago left. The room was silent. I was staring at him. I started. "Yes." Without calculating. "Yes. That's going to start a war." He turned to look at me then. And his face had none of the precision of the man I'd met in that first meeting. It was open. Almost frightfully open. "I know," he said simply. "Why?" I asked. He held my gaze for a long moment. "Because I'm tired," he said, "of being the kind of man who would do the other thing." I had spent 8 months studying Nico Valetti. I'd catalogued his habits, his fears, his strategies. I thought I understood the equation of who he was. I had never once considered that he was trying to change it. The night before war. We got my sister back. It took 4 hours and resources I'm still not fully aware of. She was unharmed. Shaken. Holding her daughter's butterfly backpack like it was the only solid thing in the world. I held them both in the hallway of Nico's house, this woman who was my only family, this small girl who had no idea what had almost happened, and I shook in a way I couldn't control. Nico stood at the end of the hallway. Not close. Just present. Making sure. Later, after my sister was settled and my niece was asleep in a guest room with more security outside the door than most heads of state receive, I found him on the roof. It was December. Cold enough to see breath. He was standing at the edge, looking out over the city. I stood next to him. "What happens now?" I asked. "The Ferrante family will respond. We'll respond to that. It will be complicated. For a while. Are you afraid?" He considered this with his usual precision. "No," he said. "For the first time in a long time, no." "Why not?" He turned to look at me. "Because for the first time in a long time," he said quietly, "I have something I actually want to survive for." I didn't say anything. But I reached out. And I took his hand. And he let me. Like someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally decided to put it down. Music settles into a contemplative, quiet background. I want to stop there for a moment. Because this story, Nico's story, my story, it's not just dark romance. It's a case study in something psychologists call attachment trauma. And once you understand it, you'll see it everywhere. In the men around you. In yourself. In the patterns that keep repeating in ways you can't explain. Let me show you what I was actually living inside. Nico Valetti displayed every classic symptom of disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment develops in childhood when the people who are supposed to make you feel safe are also the source of your fear or pain. For Nico, his father ran a crime empire that got his mother killed. The same world that provided for him destroyed the person he loved most. So his brain learned, people who love you are dangerous. Closeness equals loss. The result? As an adult, he needed control to feel safe. He needed to engineer situations rather than trust them to unfold. He couldn't allow someone to choose him freely, because what if they chose to leave? What if loving them meant losing them? What if getting close just gave someone else something to take? So he built the 47-page assessment. Engineered a situation where I couldn't choose freely. Which sounds like manipulation, and it was. But underneath it? It was the behavior of someone so afraid of real vulnerability that they'd rather manufacture safety than risk the real thing. Does this excuse it? No. Does it explain it? Completely. And here's why this matters for you. The controlling men in your life, the ones who manage, engineer, and arrange? They're not doing it because they're competent. They're doing it because they're terrified. The most controlling person in the room is almost always the most afraid. The second thing Nico's behavior illustrates is what psychologists call witnessed significance. Witnessed significance is the deep human need to be truly seen, not for your role, not for your power, not for what you provide, but for who you actually are underneath all of it. Nico was surrounded by people who saw Nico Valetti as the boss, the threat, the provider, the power. Nobody saw the 14-year-old boy who found his mother and never recovered. Nobody sat on the floor with him. And what happened when someone did? When I sat next to him, not performing comfort, not calculating what it would earn me, just being present? He started to change. Not because I fixed him. I want to be clear, you cannot fix another person. That's not love, that's a project. And projects don't love you back. He started to change because he experienced, possibly for the first time, that someone could see the real thing and stay. That's witnessed significance. And it is one of the most profound human needs we have, regardless of how much power, money, or control someone has accumulated. The man at the top of everything is often the loneliest person in the room. Not because he has no one around him, but because no one is really there. The third psychological layer in our story is something called post-traumatic growth. Most of us have heard of PTSD, the damage trauma leaves behind. Post-traumatic growth is what happens when two people survive something together, and it changes them, not by destroying who they were, but by revealing who they could be. The Ferrante crisis didn't break Nico and me. It forced him to make a choice that wasn't calculated. To act from something other than strategy. And it forced me to admit, in that hallway, holding my sister, that I hadn't just survived this marriage. I'd built something inside it. Something I didn't have a clean word for yet. But I was starting to learn one. If this story is speaking to something real in your own life, subscribe. Because I'm building this series around the intersection of dark romance and real psychology. Stories that feel like fiction but teach you something true about yourself. Next week's episode goes somewhere I genuinely wasn't prepared for. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss what I'm about to tell you happened on the night the Ferrante War ended. Month 12 arrived. The date I'd circled in my mind for an entire year. The contract end date. I woke up that morning and lay in bed for a long time. The house was quiet. Outside, December had arrived again. The city was muffled under the first real snow of the season. I thought about my beige office. My apartment, which I hadn't been back to in a year. My old life, which had been safe and small and mine. I thought about Nico. About kitchen floors and grocery lists and a man who checked window locks because he'd never felt safe. About what it means to sit with someone in their worst moment without trying to fix them. Without performing comfort. Just being there. About how I hadn't known, at 29, what that felt like to receive. And how I'd learned, at 31, that it was the only kind of love worth having. I got up. Got dressed. Walked downstairs. He was in the kitchen. Making coffee. Because that was what he did now, made 2 cups, without being asked, because sometime in the last 12 months it had become true that I drank coffee in the mornings and he knew it. He turned when he heard me. Looked at me. And in his face I saw the same thing I'd spent all morning trying to resolve. It's been 12 months, I said. I know. Silence. The car is available, he said carefully. If you want it. The settlement amount has been transferred. Your sister's new security arrangements will remain in place regardless of. Nico. He stopped. I crossed the kitchen. Took the coffee cup he'd made for me. Sat down at the table. Tell me something true, I said. He was very still. Then he sat down across from me. I don't want you to go, he said. Simple. Unguarded. Nothing calculated about it at all. Then I won't, I said. It wasn't a grand declaration. No one got on their knees. No one made promises they didn't understand yet. Just two people, equally damaged, equally afraid, equally tired of pretending they weren't either, deciding to stay. And for 3 weeks. For 3 weeks it was the quietest, most ordinary, most profound 3 weeks of my life. And then Drago came to find me. Not Nico. Drago. Who had not sought me out directly in 14 months of living in that house. He appeared in the doorway of the library where I was working. "You need to come," he said. "Where's Nico?" Something in Drago's face, that face that communicated almost nothing, shifted. "That's why you need to come. The hospital was 40 minutes away." I don't remember the drive. I remember the doctor. Young. Tired. Choosing her words with the care that medical professionals use when the words are going to hurt. "He was brought in 40 minutes ago," she said. "He's stable now." "But what happened?" She hesitated. "Miss Solano, is there someone in your husband's life who might want to?" "What happened?" My voice came out completely flat. "He was poisoned," she said quietly. "Something in his coffee this morning. We believe it was administered at the house." The coffee. The coffee he'd made for both of us. The 2 cups. One for him. One for me. Someone in that house had poisoned him. In the cup meant for him. Which meant they knew which cup was his. They knew our routine. They'd been close enough to know which of us drank from which side of the kitchen counter. This wasn't the Ferrante family. This was someone inside. Someone who had watched us. Someone who had waited. I sat down in that hospital corridor. And I thought about 47 pages. About the person who had sold information to the Ferrante family 8 months ago. About the files I have access to now. The accounts. The names. About the fact that I was, still, a forensic accountant. And I was very, very good at finding things I wasn't supposed to find. I pulled out my phone. And I started looking. I found it in 40 minutes. One transaction. Buried under 9 layers of transfers. $40,000. Paid 3 weeks ago. The day after I told Nico I wasn't leaving. Someone had wanted us separated. Had been watching long enough to know that direct force wouldn't work. So they'd waited. For the moment, Nico let his guard down. For the moment, he stopped being careful. For the moment, he trusted someone. I looked at the name attached to that account. And the world went very quiet. Because I recognized it. Not as one of Nico's enemies. As someone I ate dinner with. Someone who had sat at our table. Someone who had handed me coffee. Someone I had never suspected. Because I had been so busy watching for threats from outside. I never looked at the person sitting next to me. Dead silence. To be continued. I know. I know. I heard myself say, to be continued, and I felt you react. Here's what I need you to do right now. Subscribe. If you haven't already, subscribe. Because part 2 is coming and it answers every question that's racing through your head right now. Who was at that table? Who paid $40,000 to separate us? Who knew our routine well enough to know which cup was his? And more importantly, what does a forensic accountant do when she realizes the most dangerous person in the room has been hiding in plain sight? Comment below with your guess. Who do you think it was? Because I'm going to read every single comment. And the person who guesses closest to the truth, I'll dedicate the opening of part 2 to you. Also, if any part of today's psychology breakdown resonated. If the part about attachment trauma, or witnessed significance, or what it means to be seen, if any of that reflected something from your own life. Tell me. I read every comment. And this community is built on honesty. Nico survived the poisoning. But what came next? What came next nearly broke us both. I'll see you in part 2.